This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. 3 monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
Good evening, everybody. Please take your seats. Welcome to the monthly meeting of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. Thank you for coming. The Vegetarian Society of Hawaii is a not-for-profit organization founded in 1990 to promote human health, animal rights, and protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education. It is one of the largest local vegetarian societies in North America with more than 1,200 members. We'd like to urge you to join the Vegetarian Society tonight if you're not already a member. Members receive an informative newsletter, are welcome to attend social events, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores, including Down to Earth and Huckleberry Farms. And now it's time to introduce our special guest tonight. Pattrice Jones is the coordinator of the Global Hunger Alliance, a coalition of more than 90 environmental, animal liberation, and social justice organizations from around the world, united in opposition to the expansion of industrial animal agriculture, and in favor of more efficient, ethical, and environmentally sustainable solutions to hunger and malnutrition. Pattrice Jones has published extensively on many issues, including health care, the environment, politics, feminism, law, and racism. She is nearly finished with her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Ms. Jones's talk this evening is entitled Food Sovereignty, Environmental Justice, and the Geopolitics of Meat. Please welcome Pattrice Jones.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. However, I must admit I'm a little bit nervous about all these free food samples afterwards, because I figure as this meeting starts to go on, and I'm going on and on, your mind is going to be more and more occupied with the idea of these free food samples, what they might be, how good they might taste, how much you wish you had them. And that'll make it a little harder for you to pay attention to me. It's kind of funny how it works, isn't it? Food gets in your mind and you just can't get it out. And if that craving doesn't get satisfied, it just grows and grows and grows. Well, if that's how it feels for you at a meeting like this, or maybe when you're at work before lunchtime, maybe lunch is a half hour late, you can't even concentrate on anything because all you can think about is what you want for lunch. We've all had this experience, yes? Well, if that's how it feels for you, imagine what it feels like to be chronically hungry, to never quite get enough to eat, and to be not at all sure whether or not there will be food in the next room waiting for you. Imagine how hard it will be to concentrate on the basic activities of daily life. Imagine how hard it would be to do what you might need to do to get a little more money and a little more food. You know how cranky you get when you haven't eaten and you need to eat? Well, imagine being that way all the time. Imagine how hard it will be to have decent relations with people because you're always feeling that way. And when I say imagine this, I really want you to imagine it if you can bear it. And I assure you, you can bear it. If people can bear to live it, you can bear to imagine it. So I really want you now and through my talk, if you can, to empathically imagine what I'm talking about. And if you will do that work, I promise you, I won't leave you feeling demoralized. At the end, you will walk out of here not only having a very clear, heartfelt sense of the problem, but also a very clear sense of what you can and will do to make a difference in the problem. So let's get back to imagining not having the food. Imagine what that's like for you as an individual. And we're not even talking about the people who are so short of food that they might die at any point. Right now we're just talking about chronic hunger and malnutrition. So imagine what that's like for you as an adult. Then imagine, what is that like for a family? What does this constant cognitive disorientation, this constant difficulty in relating to people, this constant difficulty in thinking of anything other than food and where you might get it next, what is that going to do to your family relations? Imagine you're a child in a family living with chronic hunger or malnutrition. Imagine how you're going to then see your siblings as competitors for scarce resources. Imagine how that will drive a wedge between you, a wedge that maybe never heal. Imagine that you're the mother of those two children, never knowing how you're going to get the food for them. Then imagine what would be the impact on a society of being composed of families struggling with these issues. Because we do have, of course, hunger and malnutrition here in the United States, in every developed country, as well as in the low-income countries. So everywhere in the world, including right here on this island, we have families who are every day living with the things I've just described. Children who aren't doing well in school because they're not getting enough to eat, who aren't having warm and loving familial relationships because of competition for scarce resources within the family. We have that going on right here. But then take it a step further and imagine a village or even a whole country where most of the people aren't getting enough to eat. Most of the families are living with this kind of daily struggle. And imagine what that would do to the culture itself, to the ability of the people to participate in democracy and empower themselves, to the tendency or the susceptibility to fall for charismatic leaders who promise to take you out of something, if only you'll fight for this thing and kill these other people, by the way. I ask you to imagine these things just because I want hunger to be real to you. I'm going to talk about the numbers now, and the numbers can be pretty numbing. So when we're listening to the numbers, when we're thinking about the scope of the problem, let's remember that each one of those numbers is an individual dealing with an actual physical hungry stomach. So, 826 million people worldwide living with chronic hunger and malnutrition. 60 million facing such an urgent food crisis that if food is not forthcoming soon, death will be imminent. In addition to that, it's estimated that by 2025, 3.5 billion people are going to be facing chronic water shortages. And we know, of course, that being thirsty is just as bad, probably worse, than being hungry. And we know, of course, that you need water for food. Right now, 24,000 people die every single day in hunger-related illnesses. The vast majority of those children under the age of 5. That works out to roughly one child dead every 2 seconds. It's all completely unnecessary. The farmers of the world produce more than enough food to feed everybody. There's no shortage of food. The farmers of the world produce enough grain alone to feed everybody 3,500 calories a day, which, I couldn't even eat that much if I tried. And that's grain. That's just grain. That's not even counting the vegetables and the fruits and the root crops and all of the other fine things that we can eat. No, there's no shortage of food. None at all. The only thing that keeps people hungry is unequal distribution and inefficient use of the food resources that we have. And right at the top of the list concerning both inequality and inefficiency has got to be meat and other animal proteins. When I say inefficiency, well, we'll talk about that in more detail later, but of course, everyone here knows, and those who don't know will certainly know by the time you walk out of here, that it takes far more plant, water, land, and energy resources to produce a meat-based diet than it does to produce a plant-based diet. So there's inefficiency right there. Inequality, well, who's eating the meat? Who's eating the animal-based foods? Well, it's wealthy people in wealthy nations, mostly in Europe and the United States, and in nations where there's perhaps not such a high access to meat, we find that it's men more than women who are consuming the meat. So there's inequality with regard to gender as well. But let's go back to inefficiency for a minute, because we need to be really, really clear about this. If the grains that we feed now to animals were consumed directly by people, there would be no hunger and malnutrition. None. But of course, who wants to live on grain alone? So here's what's even more remarkable. If we converted the lands that are currently used to grow acre upon hundreds of thousands of acres of genetically modified corn and soy destined to be fed to livestock, if we converted those fields onto which fertilizers and pesticides and far too much water are dumped, if we converted those fields to the cultivation of a diverse array of traditional fruit, vegetable crops, choosing for each region the crops that were most appropriate for that region in terms of the amount of water that they need, in terms of their acclimation to the climate, and in terms of whether or not they're part of the traditional diet. Well, if we did that, well then, again, no hunger, plus we'd all be healthier, we'd all eat better, and the farmers would have more income. And that's very important to remember, too. One fact that never fails to shock people in the United States, although people in developing countries are well aware of it, is that the majority of families living with hunger are, in fact, farm families. The majority of families living with hunger and malnutrition in the world are families where they are making a living growing food. But what they are growing is generally a cash crop. Often livestock feed, which is often exported to a wealthier country like the United States, where it's then fed to livestock. The farmer, because of price supports and farm aid and various machinations of international trade, doesn't get a very good price at all for the crop, and so doesn't get enough to feed his or her family. I say his or her family because, in fact, the majority of farmers in the world are female. So here she is. She can't get a good price for her crop. Why, you say, does she keep growing the cash crop? Well, because she's in debt to the seed companies like Monsanto, which I know is active around here, and Cargill, also active around here. Perhaps in debt to other providers of expensive inputs if he or she is hooked into perhaps providing growing chickens for one of the poultry companies, indebted to the company which built the house that they use for the chickens, and so they can't get out of growing the cash crop. This terrible state of affairs, where all of these people are living with hunger and malnutrition, and most of them are living with hunger and malnutrition even though they grow food and might have even had a good crop this year. This terrible situation has led people in the international community, progressive activists in the international community who work on issues of hunger and malnutrition, to start to talk about a very important concept, the concept of food sovereignty. What food sovereignty means is that the farmers and the consumers, not the governments and the corporations, have to control the food supply. And what we've come increasingly to understand is that if you don't have food sovereignty, then you really don't have full political sovereignty. Because maybe you can vote But if you can't feed your family, how many choices do you really have? If you don't control food and water, if the corporations control food and water, and the World Bank controls food and water, and the USA controls food, the corporations based in the USA, well then the people don't have real control over their lives. And that's why this whole issue of food sovereignty has begun to be stressed more and more. Now, this is a meeting of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, so I think you'd be very, very interested to know some things that happened recently at Rome at what was called the Forum for Food Sovereignty, which was a meeting of non-governmental organizations from all over the world. This meeting ran parallel with the World Food Summit, which was where all the government leaders were meeting and scratching their heads and saying, oh, why haven't we done enough about hunger? And doing everything they could to not answer the question accurately. Elsewhere in Rome, the activists were meeting and figuring out what really needs to be done about hunger. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of activists representing agriculture reform organizations and nutrition organizations and animal welfare organizations, environmental organizations, social justice organizations, any organization you can think of having to do with food, met in this huge building in Rome to decide what we will do, what we need to do, and what we will do. And there's some things you'll be very interested to know. First of all, of course, there was a demonstration before the meeting. And at this demonstration, which wound through the streets of Rome, the largest, loudest, and most well-organized contingent was the contingent of people marching behind the banner of the Global Hunger Alliance promoting a plant-based diet. Then when we got into the meeting, which lasted for several days, of course, there were two very important outcomes. First of all, in the document that came out of the meeting, which was embraced by all of these activists from all over the world, that document identified industrial animal agriculture, also known as factory farming, as a cause of world hunger, and stated specifically that it can never be used to end world hunger. Secondly, there's a plan of action that was embraced again by all the delegates to this world meeting, and that action plan specifically calls for people to, quote, reduce if not eliminate, unquote, consumption of animal-based foods. Again, understanding that that's the only way we can end world hunger. Now, why do we seem to be moving towards this consensus, where even people who aren't themselves members of vegetarian societies or members of animal liberation organizations are starting to understand that meat consumption causes world hunger and starting to call for reduced meat consumption worldwide? Why is that? Well, the most obvious reason is the most obvious reason: how much food it takes to feed animals, and the fact that if that food were fed to people, we could end hunger. And to be quite specific about it, well, of course it varies from animal to animal and type of meat and type of animal-based food, but we're talking at least 10 pounds of vegetable protein for every pound of animal protein. If we factor in all of the things that go into the plants that the animals eat before they themselves or their bodily fluids are converted into food, then we find out that a person consuming a meat-based diet consumes indirectly enough resources to feed 20 people an entirely healthy and balanced plant-based diet. So that's the most obvious reason people are starting to embrace the vegetarian solution to hunger. But there are other reasons as well, specifically having to do with the waste of resources and the environmental impact involved in meat production. And I'm just going to quickly talk about land and water and energy, because all three are wasted in the course of producing animal-based food, and water and land are also polluted in the course of producing animal-based food. So let's talk about land first. Just give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of inefficiency. A 2.5 acres of land can support 15 people if wheat is grown, 19 people on rice, 1 person on beef, if the land's producing beef. So land is wasted in meat production, but it's not just wasted, it's also destroyed. Intensive grazing causes accelerated soil erosion, soil compaction, decreased percolation of the rain into the soil. Once you get all that going, then what you're looking at is runoff, depleted water tables, and eventually desertification. Desertification leads us to water, of course. And again, the figures are interesting. I'm only going to give you a few because I suspect that many people here in the audience are familiar with many of these figures. For those who aren't, I'd recommend The Food Revolution by John Robbins is an excellent source of some basic facts to start out with. So, water. Well, the liters of water required to produce 1 kilogram of soybeans, 2,000. 1 kilogram of corn, a little less, 1,400. 1 kilogram of beef, when all uses of water to produce the beef are taken into account, 100,000 liters of water. And we're in the middle of a worldwide water crisis here. I told you at the beginning, 3.5 billion people are going to be living without adequate access to water by 2025 if something doesn't change. And here we've got people scarfing down quarter-pounders. So, given that inefficiency, what it boils down to essentially is that a person who is consuming a healthy vegetarian diet will indirectly consume about 300 gallons of water a day. And that's the water that's used to grow the plants that you eat as well as the water using processing. If you're eating your typical meat-based diet, you're going to consume 4,200 gallons of water per day. All of the uses of water that are involved in producing meat. And let me just go through them just so that we're really clear about that. You have the water that the animal drinks, which in the case of many animals is quite a bit. You have the water used to grow the plants that the animal eats, which is the most significant use of the water. Then you have the water used to wash the waste away from the intensive confinement places, which is a vast amount of water. Then you have the water used in the processing plant, and it all adds up to, as I said, 100,000 liters of water for 1 kilogram of beef. And that's not all. We've got land, we've got water. We're also talking about extreme inefficiency with regard to fossil fuels. Why? 2 reasons. First, because so many plants go into animals and so many petroleum-based fertilizers are used to grow these plants. That's one use. But the greater use is all the trucking that's involved. Because if you think about it, if you're eating vegetables, in most instances the vegetables just trucked from one place to another, maybe one little stop. Whereas with the meat industry, you'll have feed is trucked from the farmer to the silo where it's held, and then it's trucked to where the animal feeding operation is. Then the animals themselves are trucked to the processing plant. Then the cut-up body parts are transported wherever they're going to go. It all adds up to a lot greater use of fossil fuel than most people understand. And for this reason, the water usage, the fossil fuel usage, and the land usage, the Union of Concerned Scientists recently came out and said, if you want to do something for the environment, well, the most important thing you can do is stop driving a fossil fuel-based car. But the second thing you can do, right behind that, is stop eating meat. So more and more people understand this, and again, more and more people are therefore embracing the vegetarian solution, not only to hunger and malnutrition, but to providing a healthy food supply for all of us without destroying the planet in the process. Now, if that weren't enough, I still have more reasons to oppose animal-based foods. And I'm just going to talk about them briefly, especially with the understanding that these are reasons that are starting to be important to activists all over the world, not just your typical vegetarian or animal liberation activist. The first issue that's really important is the whole issue of farm aid or farm subsidies. Now, Many people in this room probably know that the only reason that meat is so cheap is because it's heavily subsidized both directly and indirectly by the government. If you had to pay the real price for meat, well, hardly anybody would ever eat meat. If you think about the cost of all of that vegetable protein that I was talking about that the animal eats, and all of that water, and all of that fossil fuel into 1 kilogram of meat, think how much that kilogram of meat would cost if you were paying the actual price. You don't pay the actual price because the government subsidizes the industry. Now, they hardly ever subsidize it directly because they don't want you to know that they're subsidizing these big fat corporations. So, what they do, for example, is to say something like, we need to bail out the corn farmers. The corn farmers aren't going to get a good price for their crops, so we have to subsidize that. Sounds good. Nobody wants the corn farmers to starve. The corn farmers are, for the most part, caught up in that cycle of debt. They're growing corn that is not going to be eaten by people. It's corn that's going to be eaten by the livestock companies. Why is the price so low? Because the livestock companies are the primary market, and they dominate the market. Instead of a monopoly on something when you're selling, they're the monopoly buyer for corn and soy. So they can say, we're not going to pay more than this. Doesn't matter that this is less than it costs to produce it. We're not going to pay more than this. And they can do that knowing that the government will secretly bail them out by bailing out the farmers. Make sense? Okay, well, more and more people in the U.S. are getting mad about it, and what you might not know is that people all over the world are mad about the United States farm subsidies. When you see these big so-called anti-globalization protests, when you see these protests of farmers in so-called third world countries, and they're shaking signs that say no WTO, sometimes they're also shaking signs about U.S. farm aid. And the reason is because the U.S. farm subsidies allow these corporations to dump their products at below cost in countries where the farmers are already struggling to make a living. Now, at first you might think, oh, well, that's good, cheap food. But what we're talking about is dumping unhealthy chicken feet, or so-called what they call bush legs, which are chicken legs, into countries where people have not traditionally eaten a lot of meat, but dumping them at prices so cheap that the people are actually going to give up what they've traditionally eaten to eat that. And that, of course, is going to drive the farmers who are growing those traditional crops out of business and right on into the arms of the multinational corporations. So that's farm aid. Another issue, genetically modified organisms. Well, of course, I could talk for an hour about genetically modified organisms and the reasons that people oppose them, and I'm happy to talk more about that if asked. What I will simply say is that many people oppose them for spiritual reasons, but many, many more people oppose them for environmental reasons, or for the simple fact that they were created to help the seed companies make more money, not for any other reason at all. Well, a lot of people oppose genetically modified organisms, and they'll say, I'm not going to eat them. And then they wonder why I'm not going to eat them. You do a survey and you find out that the majority of the public says, I'm not going to eat them. I don't trust them, or I disagree with them spiritually, I'm not going to eat them. But it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter that we won't eat them. Why? Because they're not made for us to eat anyway. Most of the corn grown in the United States is fed to animals. So all this genetically modified corn is a way to provide a stable, cheap supply of what is the highest cost of any meat production company, which is the feed for the livestock. So, people who are upset about genetically modified organisms are starting to see past the obvious and say, oh, well, we've got to go after those meat corporations too, because they're really the driving force. So we have a lot of reasons to oppose them. We've got hunger, poverty, disenfranchisement, because of course when people are caught up in these cycles of poverty and not controlling their food supply, they're not truly empowered in a democracy. We also have all the environmental reasons that we talked about. And that's still not all of the problem. Because, of course, I haven't even talked about the most direct victims of all, who are, of course, the animals. And just as an aside, I don't want anybody here to think that just because it took me this long to get to the animals, I think that's a less important issue than the other issues I've been talking about. One thing that wasn't mentioned, I don't think, in the introduction is that in addition to my work with the Global Hunger Alliance, at my home, I run a sanctuary for chickens who have been who rescued from or escaped the Thanks. And let's just be real clear that at least half of that applause was for my partner, who's home taking care of the chickens and is always stuck home taking care of the chickens while I get to do things like go to Hawaii and talk. So thank you, Miriam. Well, it's good that we had a little bit of a laugh because I'm about to talk about more grim things. Just as there really weren't words to talk about the suffering that's involved in living with hunger and malnutrition, I think we have to say the same thing about animal suffering in the course of not only meat production, but production of other animal-based foods. I'll just bring up a few issues. Gestation crates, hogs, females confined in these crates, kept pregnant and confined in little crates where they can't even turn around, often can't even stand up, developing all sorts of health problems as a result, hardly able to walk, and then tortured mercilessly to get them to walk themselves to the knife. Hens confined in egg factories with less than this amount of space per bird, never able to stretch their wings, never able to do anything but grip onto wire so tightly that their feet sometimes become permanently crippled, tips of their beaks burned off to keep them from pecking themselves and each other to death in frustration, never seeing the sunlight, never breathing fresh air, never getting to do any of the things that it would be natural for a bird to do. Dairy cows. Well, I happen, besides running the chicken sanctuary, which I do because I happen to live in the area of the United States that invented factory farming, dubious distinction at best. Besides that, I happen to live near a dairy. I didn't know this before I didn't know that this happened before I moved there and had to hear it. But what we hear sometimes over the hills are the cows crying after their calves have been taken from them. And that got me thinking, can you imagine? Especially the women here. I mean, can you imagine? You give birth, and then someone just rips your child away because somebody else wants to drink your milk? I mean, it's revolting and bizarre, in addition to being cruel. And I have to say, having heard these cries, as much physical pain as they feel from mastitis and other conditions involved in being selected to give so much milk and being kept constantly pregnant, I'm starting to believe that the thing that they suffer from most is the loss of their children that way. There aren't any words, and yet we can't just pass over it in silence. We have to do something. And of course we have. And we've had some success, yes? In various arenas, in the United States and even more in Europe, we've managed to pass a lot of animal welfare legislation saying, well, at least you can't do this. I should have mentioned before that animal agriculture is the number one source of water pollution worldwide. So in addition to wasting water, it pollutes the water that's left. Areas where I live, for example, we can't drink our water. We have to treat it because it's been so wrecked by the poultry industry. So areas like mine, states where there are concentrations of industrial animal agriculture, have started passing environmental legislation and putting the squeeze on the companies that way. At the same time, to a lesser degree, but still importantly, some of the workers who work for these big corporations have started to organize and win some gains because you may not know this, but the number one dangerous occupation in terms of number of occupational injuries, meat processing. The conditions, horrific. In the past, when they've tried to organize, for example, when they tried to organize at Purdue plants in the 1980s, Purdue went to the Gambino crime family in New York City and had them stop the union organizing drive. I mean, the conditions for workers are really wretched. They've begun fighting back. Lots of fines lately on Tyson and Purdue both, for example. More animal welfare legislation, more environmental legislation, more labor legislation. All of that increases their costs. Makes it a little bit more difficult for them to do business. At the same time, we have fine organizations like the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii doing what they can to drive down demand for these products. So they're squeezed from both sides. Yes, their costs are going up, and at least here in the United States, demand for their products is flat and may even go down. All of that we should feel good about. But we can't feel too good, because we have to understand the nature of a corporation, which is to be an entirely amoral, profit-seeking organism. And that means that if they're starting to not make quite as much money because their costs are going up and their market's going down, they're going to find some place to go. And where they have set their sights, believe it or not, is on the regions of the world where people are living with hunger and malnutrition. Yes, it's true. What they want to do is to expand both meat production and meat consumption in regions of the world where people have traditionally not eaten much meat and these days are struggling with not having much to eat at all. They want to do this and aim to do it with the help of entities like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and their friends in the U.S. government, like George Bush, who's said recently, we want people in China eating U.S. beef. And best of all, or worst of all, they want to do this under the guise of hunger relief. Right? We want to give those people more meat. They need more protein. Well, we see this as, of course, a lie, but also we see it as both dietary colonialism and environmental racism. I want to talk a little about each of those concepts. Of course, we know, just across the board, that the worst thing in the world you could do to a place where people are living with hunger and malnutrition is bring in an industry that wastes what natural resources there are, pollutes the natural resources that are left, is an extremely expensive way to produce food, so you have to have external corporations provide the equipment and put the farmers and the people in debt to those corporations who will provide in return very dangerous jobs. And most of the food produced isn't even going to be consumed locally because it'll be too dangerous to be consumed locally. It'll be exported to wealthy countries where the people who say, not in my backyard, about a hog facility still want to eat their bacon. That's why we call this environmental racism. The issue, environmental racism, for those who aren't familiar with the concept, is the fact that polluting industries tend to be located within the United States in communities of color and in other disenfranchised communities. Worldwide, it's increasingly being seen as the tendency of multinational corporations, when squeezed for environmental reasons, to find countries in Asia, Africa, or South America that they can relocate, knowing that they won't, or believing that they won't face as much resistance because the governments of those countries are in hock to the wealthy countries, and therefore they have to do what the World Bank and the IMF say. Of course, sometimes the people have other ideas and they fight back anyway, and that's always very beautiful. But the key is locating destructive industries, in this instance the meat industry, in places where it's thought that people won't be able to fight back. And this is happening in the United States as well. Right now, the Lakota people in South Dakota are fighting a huge hog installation that was installed on what are supposed to be sovereign lands, and at least part of it is on what were sacred lands, installed with the help of a tribal council that was sort of recognized by the U.S. government but isn't recognized by the people. You probably know how that works. So right now it's there. The hog installation is there. As you probably know, folks who live on reservations on the mainland are essentially living in little third world countries within the United States, and their levels of poverty and poverty-related health problems are the equivalent of those of people in third world countries. So these are folks who have been struggling with health problems anyway, and they're already just a few years into this whole hog installation starting to see health problems associated with all the hog manure seeping in to their waters. I mentioned dietary colonialism. I want to talk about that a little bit. What you might or might not know is that during the era of European imperialism, it was often said that the Europeans were superior because they were a meat-eating culture. This was one of the many reasons that Europeans claimed that they were superior to people of African descent and people of Native American descent, people of Asian descent, because we eat more meat. That somehow, I'm still not very clear on the logic behind that, but nonetheless, it was one of the claims. And that claim is implicit in these ideas of trying to get people to eat more meat as hunger relief, rather than making sure that people have adequate access to the resources they need to get the elements of their traditional diet, not adopt our unhealthy meat-based diet. And just the arrogance of suggesting that folks switch over when we know what will happen. That's why we talk about it as dietary racism. And I just want to talk about 3 issues with regard to that. The first is, of course, health. It's, in fact, true that in low-income countries, as incomes rise, people often do start to consume more meat. And this is for a complex number of reasons, including the idea that meat is a sign of progress, meat consumption is a sign of Westernism, a sign of modernity, a sign of affluence. To go to McDonald's or to KFC, you know they've just built the 700th KFC in China? I was just in Pakistan, there's Pizza Hut there. Folks are hit with these advertising messages. We're not the only ones that are seeing all these advertising. Folks are hit with these advertising messages. Eat meat, it's healthy. Eat meat, it'll make you more virile. Eat meat instead of more impotent, etc. As a result, the World Health Organization recently came out with a warning. And the warning said this: for the first time in history, incidences of degenerative diseases, meaning cancer and heart disease and diabetes, incidences of degenerative diseases in developing countries has eclipsed the incidence of infectious disease. It was always infectious disease that was the big problem in those countries. Now it's degenerative diseases. And the World Health Organization is quite clear about why. Diet change, and specifically eating more animal protein. So, the first thing we have to worry about is the health of people if these corporations succeed in getting them to eat more meat. The second thing we have to worry about for the people, because of course we also have to very much worry about the animals, the second thing we have to worry about the people is their culture. Think of how central food is to culture. What happens to a culture when the people of that culture change their diet suddenly? We don't really know, but it's an interesting problem that people have started to think about. And finally, again, we come back to the issue of the agricultural economy. Because if these corporations succeed in increasing both meat consumption and production in these low-income countries, the farmers are going to suffer yet again. I think it's time to talk about what we should do, huh? Well, the good news is that there's one thing that every single person can do, whether they're involved with an organization or not. One thing that every single person can do that will absolutely and very concretely make a contribution towards the reduction of hunger in the world. And that same one thing will absolutely, concretely, definitively reduce the amount of waste and pollution that you personally are responsible for. And at the same time, that one thing will reduce the amount of violence in the world that you're complicit in. Of course, that one thing is, if you're still eating meat, go vegetarian. If you're still eating other animal protein, go vegan. If you'll do that, you'll save thousands of gallons of water a week. You'll save the lives of 83 animals a year. And you'll save enough resources to feed 20 people. All by doing what must be one of the most easiest things in the world, not buying something. On a side note, before I continue, that I stressed going vegan if you're not already, because a lot of people think it's just meat, and it's not. Not only is there incredible cruelty involved in the production of dairy and eggs, but those are also extremely wasteful of natural resources. It takes I've got some facts for eggs right here when I was talking about how many people can be fed on 2.5 acres, and I said wheat 15 people, rice 19 people. Well, and beef 1 person? Well, guess what? Eggs 1 person. It's not so different with the other forms of animal protein. And so if you're a member of the Vegetarian Society and you're vegetarian but not vegan, please think about going vegan. If you've done that and you still want to do more, there are a lot of things that you can do as an individual. And by the way, after I get done up with talking about what you can do as an individual, I will talk about what organizations can do. Well, one thing that individuals can do is help to spread the word about the connections between meat and other problems that people are already concerned about. Problems like environmental destruction, problems like world hunger, problems like poverty. And this is an area in which writing letters really can help. Writing letters, for example, to your local newspaper whenever you get a chance, whenever there's an article about hunger or drought or water or food, you can find a way. And just to prove that, I have this week's Honolulu Weekly. And we have 2 examples. One, in the letters section, some fool has written in with the usual, those vegetarians, they talk about ending violence, but they kill the poor tomatoes. But see, here's the thing. Of course, someone needs to write back so that anyone who read this letter and thought it was funny and true understands that, in fact, when you eat animals, you are killing a lot more plants. I myself do think that plants are sentient to a degree, or at least I know I don't know whether or not they are. Sure seems like some trees are. And absolutely, I don't want to kill plants unnecessarily either. That's one of the reasons I'm vegan, because it takes a lot fewer plants. So somebody needs to say that. But you can say that in your first paragraph, and then you can go on and say, and by the way, all of this waste of resources involved in the production of meat and dairy and eggs, that's what keeps people hungry around the world. Then you throw out a few of the statistics about that. And you've taken an opportunity to explain to people who might not be concerned about animals and might not be concerned about their own health, but also might not want to contribute to world hunger. Here's another example. 2 in the same paper. We have an article about people from Micronesia living on Hawaii, and it happens to mention the health problems that people in Micronesia itself and Micronesians living in Hawaii are dealing with now because they're now consuming diets, quote, heavy with sugar and processed fats, instead of their traditional diet in which, quote, breadfruit is king. Then goes on to talk about how people in the Marshall Islands generally don't starve. because of a culture of sharing of food. Now, to me, that's a wonderful opportunity to write in several different letters about dietary racism, about the dangers of giving up traditional diets in favor of Western diets, about dietary colonialism, about the simple health issues related. So, I've made my point. Write some letters if you're an individual who needs to take another step. And the other thing I want to say before I move on to what groups can do, about what individuals can do, is talk to your friends and your relatives. I've noticed a rather alarming tendency of people to treat vegetarianism and veganism like some kind of personal choice that doesn't impact anybody but yourself, as though it were the equivalent of sexual preference, for example. As if it was just something you do to your own body, rather than to the bodies of non-consenting others. But in fact, eating meat and eating animal products is doing something to the bodies of other beings who don't consent, namely the animals. And if you don't believe me, visit a slaughterhouse, if you dare, and listen to them not consenting. Or come to my sanctuary and watch them fly out of the coop every morning, showing how much they love their freedom and how glad they are not to be in these cages or dead. So what you do hurts the animals if you're eating meat or animal proteins, and it doesn't just hurt the animals. We've just talked about it hurting the environment, and we've just talked about how our individual dietary choices are part of this world's food system in which 826 people live with hunger and malnutrition every day. So it's not an innocent choice that you just do or don't do for your own health. And so if you've hesitated to talk to people about this because of this whole personal choice issue, I would really encourage you to think through that and then find ways. And you still have to be yourself, and you still have to talk to people as yourself, which might be deferential, might be strident, might be filled with facts, might be filled with appeals to emotion. It all depends on how you best communicate. But please don't shy away from talking about this under some misguided notion of personal preference. All right, groups, what can you do? I know there's at least 2 organizations represented here today, and perhaps there are some others. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what organizations can and I guess I would say should do with regard to these issues. First of all, local organizations like the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, and I'm sorry, is it Animal Rights Hawaii? Yes. Welcome to join Global Hunger Alliance, which is an international coalition of local organizations. Right now we've got more than 100 organizations from more than 25 countries, including both wealthy and very much not wealthy countries, including environmental organizations and social justice organizations and animal liberation organizations and vegetarian societies and agriculture reform organizations and anti-globalization organizations and just about any organization you could think of that might care about industrial animal agriculture or the world food system is welcome in Global Hunger Alliance. And I'm happy to say that we're only about a year old. We've already made quite a few strides forward. Those things that I mentioned about the Forum for Food Sovereignty occurred largely because of our work. We are, as far as I know, the very first coalition or alliance to include both social justice organizations from developing countries and animal liberation organizations from the U.S. and Europe, and we feel really good about bringing those 2 types of organizations together to work on this shared problem. So I would encourage any organization here today or listening to the video to think about joining Global Hunger Alliance. You can visit www.globalhunger.net to find out how to do that. But enough of a pitch for my organization. We'll go on to what your organizations might be able to do to make even more headway against these problems I've been talking about than we've already been able to make. The first thing is to make the connections. Make the connections in both theory and practice. And by make the connections, I mean make the connections between issues and make connections between people and organizations. And you need to make the connections in both theory and practice. Now, when I talk about making the connections in theory, what do I mean? What I mean is you need to make sure you really do have a good understanding of how meat production produces poverty, and why people living in poverty and working class people ought to care about that. You should just understand that well in your mind. You should understand the connection between sexism and speciesism. If you don't know about that, read Carol Adams' book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, to get a start. It's something you really need to understand. You need to understand concepts such as those I was talking about today, such as dietary racism. You need to understand how the promotion of the unhealthy Western meat-based diet as some kind of superior diet to be emulated hurts people of color here and abroad. You need to understand very concrete things, examples of dietary racism, such as the inclusion of milk in the school lunch program when the vast majority of African American and Asian American children are lactose intolerant. You need to understand that this so-called achievement gap that suffered between African American children and white children may have something to do with the fact that after lunch, probably the majority of African American children are feeling a little bit bloated, gassy, and less able to concentrate because they've been given milk to drink when they're lactose intolerant. Once you've got a good understanding of those kinds of issues, then it's time to put them in practice. And obviously, one way to put them into practice is have events like this, where people talk about the connections, put those connections into your publications, onto your website. Our foe is so formidable. We cannot afford to leave anyone out of our struggle. We must find ways to work together across barriers of identity, across barriers of geography, across barriers of the particular aspect of the issue that we're interested in. We have to find a way to all work together, even though we're very, very different. It really is possible to feed the world while preserving the planet. Absolutely no reason we can't. It really is possible for us to end unnecessary human and animal suffering. We can't end all suffering in the world. Suffering is part of life. We can end the unnecessary suffering. And it is possible to bring ourselves back into balance with the rest of nature. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Pattrice, for an excellent and moving lecture. So thank you all for coming.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. 3 monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.